If you're looking for the world's best CBD products, look no further than PalomaVerdeCBD.com, a like-minded business out of San Antonio, Texas, owned by a great couple, Carlos and Vanessa. They love the show. They're supporting the show. They're giving you a discount when you buy these products because you like this show. We'll get there at the end here, but I've been ranting and raving about the sports cream for a long time. It is the best. I genuinely mean that. So if you're sore from workouts, go check out the CBD Menthol Sports Cream. If you're having trouble sleeping, they've got the Sleep Bundle CBD Pack. Maybe you've got pets like I do, like my two French bulldogs, Lux and George, that experience inflammation in some part of their spine or their back legs or whatever. Well, look no further. They've got the pet tinctures and the CBD dog chews over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Do you have anxiety at all? Well, there's CBD gummies over there. Are you stressed after a long day? There's CBD bath bombs over there. They've got this new CBD massage oil. Carlos, one of the owners of Paloma Verde, keeps asking me if he can use it on me. I've not allowed him to do so yet, but I suspect that their CBD massage oil is quite amazing. So go check that out. All things CBD related, you will find at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. And since they support this show and they want to help the listeners of this show get a discount, I've got a promo code for you. It's BUCK, B-U-C-K. Just enter that at checkout. You will get 20% off of your order. That is BUCK, B-U-C-K, at checkout over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Tell them I sent you and enjoy the products. I know you will.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. Great to have you with me once again, rolling along this week. I'm excited to debut a new sponsor today, so stay tuned for that, of course. I'm excited about my guest, and I would say I'm excited about this topic, but it sounds almost strange to say that. It's a topic that a lot of people dance delicately around and don't want to get into too hardcore, but my guest today penned an article and he went right for the jugular, and it got a lot of retweets and press and people talking about it. And I certainly enjoyed reading it, and I reached out to him immediately. The article is called "Refusing What We Are, the Evil of Children's Transgenderism," and it's over at American Greatness, over at amgreatness.com. I link to this article in the show notes page for this episode. But as you know, like I mentioned, even on the right, people kind of approach the topic of transgenderism and kids kind of lightly. It's uncomfortable to talk about. They don't want to offend someone, or, everyone's afraid to get called the pejorative names that you're going to be called if you talk about this subject. But it is on the minds of a lot of parents. And so once I read this article, he put things so well and so bluntly, and I mean that in a good way, that I had to reach out and get him on here to discuss the issue of children's transgenderism. And so I got Jeremy Carl here. He is a senior fellow at the Clairemont Institute. He's going to tell you all about himself here as we start this interview. Jeremy Carl, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be with you, Buck.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. I was unfamiliar with your writings, and I feel kind of bad about that after finding them, especially in American Greatness is where I've now read many of them. This is your first time on the show, and so I guess I'll have you introduce yourself to my listeners, really whatever you'd like to tell them about what you do, who you are, and so on.
Sure. My name's Jeremy Carl. I'm a senior fellow at the Clairemont Institute, which is a think tank that is based out of Southern California. But in fact, we have a very distributed staff at this point. I'm actually personally in Montana, and where we relocated the earliest stages of the COVID epidemic, and are quite happy here in more politically and culturally friendly territory. I write about any number of things, any number of policy areas, from foreign policy to nationalism to immigration to transgenderism, which I think is a hot button issue that brought my writing originally to your attention. I also served as a senior official in the Trump administration. I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior and was later appointed by the president to the National Board of Education Sciences. And I guess that's it. We could go on for more, but that's the thumbnail sketch. And I live out here with Montana with my wife and 5 kids. So
wow, very cool. And for people that are watching this interview, he put this background up behind him, and I said, "It looks like Montana." And he said, "Well, it is. It's my backyard." So that's nuts. I see why, from among many reasons, you shifted towards Montana and away from Southern California.
A little better view up here.
So you were in, I guess I hadn't written this down to ask you about, but I am curious. You were in Donald Trump's cabinet, correct? Like you mentioned.
Oh, not the cabinet. I mean, I was a sub-cabinet official,
sure.
but I was a senior official in the Department of the Interior, yeah.
Did you have many interactions with him?
I didn't. I wasn't there for all that long. And one of the things I learned, when I was previously, I should have maybe mentioned, I spent over a decade at the Hoover Institution, which is also a pretty well-known conservative think tank over at Stanford. And during that time, I worked very closely with the late Secretary of State, George Shultz, who was Reagan's Secretary of State, among many other cabinet posts he held. One of the things I learned from that, and I was really fortunate to work with the Secretary for quite a while, is that you really don't actually want to be in front of the senior principal unless you absolutely have to be, because they will have their agenda for you. And then if they've got an agenda for you, if the former secretary or the president is telling you to do something, you better well do it. And that may or may not be what your immediate agenda is. And so I always, in my work, have tried to kind of do the things I need to do, be responsive to whatever senior principal I'm working closely with, but also at the same time kind of run with the things that I think that we need to be doing. So I was never one to kind of try to maximize face time with some of the celebrity politicians who've come across my path.
Well, you penned an article, a great piece called "Refusing What We Are: The Evils of Children's Transgenderism." And one of the things that stood out to me, especially I follow a lot of voices on the right, a lot of them retweeted this article and were putting it out there like, finally, someone's saying it. And I think that's a point, because even on the right, it's a topic that many kind of carefully dance around delicately, because you don't want to be pigeonholed as one of the many names that you will be called when you write a piece like this. Was that something that you consciously made an effort to like dive right in on this and go for the jugular, basically? Because did you feel it had been danced around delicately even on the right prior to this?
I do. And I think if folks read my pieces in general, they'll find a friend of mine recently was saying, a very good writer in and of her own right, that she says, "Jeremy, I'm always going in with the needle and you go in with the sledgehammer when you write." And I think that both of those things are totally valid ways to write. And in fact, sometimes I do very detailed needle pieces, but sometimes I think it's very important to speak truth with a capital T here. I think obviously there is some blowback, although I do sense a changing of the momentum a little bit. But at the same time, I think over the long term, really my interest in it ultimately is as a parent who has 5 kids, who sees how the culture of kind of pediatric transgender acceptance and gender confusion is putting them at risk and putting lots of other kids at risk. And a lot of them have unfortunately fallen down this rabbit hole with permanent consequences. And in that context, any sort of blowback I get, and there has been actually, the Democrats in DC right now are also trying to keep me off of a national commission based on my writing on this particular subject. So, I mean, that's there, but to me, that's a really minor, it's minor as compared to the kids what's at stake here.
Yeah. And I'm glad to see people like you doing this, like you said, with a sledgehammer, because on the left, they're never worried about when they use sledgehammers. In fact, they move incrementally until they don't, and it's a sledgehammer. And
Right.
they feel like, well, pop culture will accept what I'm saying with a sledgehammer.
Right.
And people on the right are always a little bit worried to do stuff like this. Do you see that as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we have to get rid of this mentality. And I want to be sympathetic to those who don't. I'm in a really fortunate situation where, both financially and because of my employer, I do certainly have more protection than some people to say what I want. So I'm not going to sort of cast aspersions on people who really don't feel that they're situated to say anything. On the other hand, I feel like if we just had the people who are situated similarly to me, who were speaking out, we would be in a much better position. And I think people react instinctively when you speak the truth and when you speak it without apology.
Yeah, I felt, and you alluded to it a while ago, there's been a bit of a shift from the general public that I feel it's sympathetic towards the right. And then, of course, this Roe v. Wade leak happened, and now I'm seeing these kind of empty slogans from pop culture people. If you're a man, you shouldn't have an opinion on this and that. So there's a bit now we're like swaying back that way briefly, but I still think even with that situation, there's more people sympathetic to overturning Roe v. Wade than may seem. I want to read the subtitle to your article, and I know sometimes editors put that there, but it is from a paragraph within the article, and I think it's even more powerful than the title. And that is, it's difficult for us to acknowledge the enormity of the crime committed against our children because it's hard for us to acknowledge how deeply we have failed. Can you talk about that statement? I guess start with, who is we?
Well, and I think I sort of mean everything from people like myself, and I don't mean to fully exclude myself in any way here from the failure, even though I have been talking about it for some time, and I've been tweeting about it. But I until recently, I hadn't really written and sat down to kind of write a piece. But even just kind of Joe parent in the street who really knows better, right? Like, we know better. But as you said, there are these pressures, or we want to get along, or we don't want to look intolerant. And there are some things that are really good to be intolerant of. And, the sterilization, mutilation of kids, like, I'll die on that hill. Okay. I really will. I'm very comfortable with that. And, I've said actually in the past, of all of the battles, I mean, there are many, many things that I think that the left will ultimately be proved wrong on. But if I had to put all my chips in the center of the table on one battle, it would be this. I mean, I think that they've just totally lost all sense of anything. And we're beginning to see, thankfully, detransitioners, that is, people who previously had a transgender identity and are now re-embracing their birth sex, speaking out. And I think as more and more people do this, the tide is going to turn against the left on this issue. I mean, again, it transcends politics to me. It's really ultimately a moral issue,
yes.
But that doesn't mean that the politics of it isn't important or that we don't need to act politically on it.
Well, I want to ask you about a term that it gets thrown around a lot, and I guess just for my listeners we can get a solid foundation on what it is, and that's groomer. And it gets thrown around as just an insult, and maybe it's not necessarily always accurate, and sometimes it is, though. What does that term mean?
Right. Well, I speak about this in the article. I quote this woman, Helena Kirshner, who's probably become the most prominent of these detransitioners speaking out, although encouragingly, again, there's a number following her, and she was on Tucker recently. But she wrote something to the effect, and again, I quoted directly in the piece, of, look, there's a time to be specifically accurate about a term, and then there's a time that we take a term because it really strongly gives the sense of what we're trying to do, even if it's not literally true that these people are actively trying to abuse children. But what they've done through normalizing this type of behavior, this type of mutilation of kids, they're grooming these kids into gender confusion. They're taking feminine boys or masculine girls or confused kids or same-sex attracted, whatever it is, and they're saying, you're not any of those things. You're the opposite sex, really. And it's just not true. It's not true, and it will have lifetime medical complications for many of these kids and social complications that we've tried to say it is true.
Are the schools the biggest area in society where a lot of this is happening?
That's my sense. And, I'm in Montana. Okay. So we're not, and I'm a little bit outside of Bozeman. So we're certainly a slightly more liberal part of Montana, but this is not exactly, it's not exactly California out here. Okay. But we've got it in our schools. Okay. They're in junior high and high school. I talk to my kids and they're like, yeah, we've got trans kids in our schools. Shouldn't surprise anybody. Again, I mentioned this in my piece, but we've got 2+% now, according to the Gallup poll, not some weird, right-wing sort of poll that we kind of messed with to get some big number. 1 out of 50 kids, more of them are kind of embracing this identity, or sort of, in this case, it's actually young adults in Gen Z, but basically among the Gen Z kids, we have actually reason to believe it's probably a little bit higher. And actually, I had this in the piece, and they took it out not for content, but just for length. But I was talking with it once about with my high schooler, and he was telling me about this, and I was actually saying, it's really important to be compassionate to these kids because they're victims, and I really do feel that way. Don't make fun of them. Don't do all these things to them. I mean, they're suffering, and that's why they've been put in this terrible situation that's going to make them suffer more. But he said to me kind of immediately, he wasn't disputing that, but he said, actually it's friends groups, and they're not all crazy, right? And so there's an element of social contagion here, what we would call, and this is, if you read Abigail Shirer's book on transgenderism in girls, which has actually gotten a fair bit of attention, she talks about this. So it is happening in schools. I think ultimately, kind of our teachers and administrators enabling it are the biggest culprits, but from there it kind of snowballs to friend groups, and they're on Tumblr or they're on TikTok or whatever else, and they're getting these identities validated, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it seems like there's outlets that are taking advantage of people with mental issues a little bit, and it's not always a mental issue. I don't even want to say it that way. It is sometimes, but if the kid's 4, it's not a mental issue. It's that he or she's confused, if they have these, if it's someone that they look to as an authority saying, oh, well, here's why you feel that way. Well, naturally, it's like training a puppy. They're going to, it lends itself to, then they start believing that. It seems like there's just there's some evil forces within this. And do you think this kind of comes down to a battle of good versus evil, like further than above the politics of it?
I do. Whether you want to couch it, I just say it's a moral battle. I think that our opponents in this don't, of course, think they're doing evil. That's often the case, but that doesn't make what they're doing any less evil because of that. And I'm glad you alluded to these younger kids, because that's important. And I talk about in my piece, Jaron Blashinsky, who is kind of better known as Jazz Jennings and has a show, I Am Jazz, that gets 1 million viewers every year, every week that it's on, and it's on the TLC channel, and he has all these endorsements. Well, he quote unquote came out to his to his parents as transgender when he was 3, according to them, and by 6 he was on TV talking about it. And I'm sorry, that is grooming. That's the only thing we can call it. It's Munchausen's by proxy from the parents. In other words, parents who kind of are embracing some disease for the attention. And what's really happened to these kids, unfortunately, these really young transgender kids, who, by the way, are treated, they're celebrated in the media. It's really criminal. That's the worst. It's bad enough for like some teenager to go on TikTok and maybe be confused. But when you have these young kids, that is the parents abusing those kids. And I think that is absolutely the right word to use. They're abusing them, and they should lose custody. At the least, they should lose custody. And it is the media perpetuating that abuse. And I think everybody involved with that sort of stuff, we should be looking to criminally refer them. I see that as a black and white issue.
I got to tell you about the wildest, weirdest, coolest, most funny sponsors I have. It's kind of like a 2-in-1. It's the Liberty Tree podcast and the Liberty Tree clothing line, which I absolutely love. We're going to talk about that in a second. As for this podcast, can you beat this description? It's kind of like if Shane McGowan did man on the street interviews in rural Northern California, and after that content was picked up by CNN, it was then analyzed on Sunday mornings by really intelligent, albeit half in the bag, but nonetheless good-looking construction workers. There you go. How about that? What they love: liberty, free speech, Western culture, family, breakfast beers, guns, training to kill with their bare hands, and, like myself, really, really bad jokes. What they are not: statists, progressives, and, well, funny. A few highlights from their podcast include episode 5, where they teach the principles of free driving and talk about how it might just save the world. Most of their predictions have come true, and one they are still tracking and updating regularly is Justin Trudeau's apparent transition. Episode 16 comes out of the gate with really strong joke about a deer that anyone can memorize and use at a party. See there? Thank you for your service. Much like this show, episodes come out every Tuesday with bonus episodes and interviews mixed in here and there. As for this clothing line that I was mentioning earlier, I love it. It's the Liberty Tree lifestyle. They are subversive fashions for free thinkers and lovers of liberty. Now, as for the websites, and of course, you get a discount code. Wait till you hear about this discount code too. The apparel site is libertytreelifestyle.com. And that's where I got the Old World Order shirt that I have. I've had several people comment on that. Well, you know where you can get it? You can get it over at libertytreelifestyle.com. Their podcast is at libertytreepodcast.org. That is libertytreepodcast.org. And I told you I've got a promo code. Back to, what these guys aren't is funny. Check out the promo code. It will get you 10% off. Counterflow with Buck Johnson. All one word. Counterflow with Buck Johnson will get you 10% off of your order. Go over to libertytreelifestyle.com and libertytreepodcast.org. Tell them I sent you, and get some of those cool shirts over there at libertytreelifestyle.com. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that. The show is called I Am Jazz. I feel good that I was not familiar with this show, and I assume a lot of my listeners aren't. But again, it's on TLC. And did you say 1 million viewers a week this is getting?
1 million viewers a week, right? And so in aggregate, I don't know how many unique viewers they have, but I'm sure it's millions over the course of a year. And how many of those are impressionable young kids who are like, well, I'm confused. I'm unhappy about this. Maybe I'm trans, right? That's what they're being told. And I would go after all those folks legally, and people will say, the kind of defeat cons will be like, oh, you can't do that, or free expression, or that's not fair. And I'm like, no, it's grooming. That truly is grooming. I mean, there's edge cases, but that's grooming. And we need to make them pay for what they're doing.
You mentioned how many of the people watching that are vulnerable teens and whatnot. I wonder how many watching that are vulnerable-minded housewives in America, in middle America, who start to think like they're there by themselves watching this all day or whatever. I don't know when the show's on, but if they don't have a solid foundation to fight something like this, a lot of middle America housewives might see that and go, well, I've noticed my kids seem this way or that way. Maybe that's it, and it kind of normalizes it through that method.
Of course, it's on TV and they're seeing it, and the person seems sympathetic and whatever else. And exactly. When you have this sort of behavior, it's a risk not just to the teens, but to the adults for whom it's normalized. And there was actually a really good Twitter thread yesterday from an African-American woman basically talking about how she had just rescued her kid from transgenderism. And one of the things she talked about was just, she took that kid out of school. She got rid of all the social media and whatnot. She basically did a cleanse, to kind of get rid of those influences. And in doing that, the kid kind of returned to embrace their actual identity. And that's, of course, the great irony, right? Is that all these transgender advocates, quote unquote, have a much more essentializing view of sex and gender than the alleged, social conservatives. Well, I am a social conservative, but social conservatives such as myself who say, look, there are boys and girls who can express their masculinity or femininity across a whole spectrum of what that might mean. That doesn't change the fact that they're a boy or a girl, right? Like that's a much more, to me, tolerant and capacious sort of way to look at this issue, as opposed to the kind of much more straitjacketed view that transgender advocates have of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the article from Gen Z to, I believe, to now that, there's been an uptick, of course, in transgenderism. And a lot of people will hear that and go, well, that's because we're more open as a society and we allow them to come out. The other side to that is that, no, there's more evil influences and people taking advantage of young kids. Again, this kid Jazz from the I Am Jazz, he or she, I'm not sure what to call the person, but was going through, where is it? I've got it written down, a gender therapist at age 3.
Right.
When kids still believe in the tooth fairy and monsters and things like that. So for the audience listening, keep in mind, this isn't like some helpful, open society guiding someone through their feelings. The kid's 3. Think about this.
Right. It's terrible. And we had, again, I talked about another young boy who, again, is sort of masquerading as a girl right now, who was testifying before the state legislature in Texas at age 8 this year, who, again, had this identity much earlier. And, for those of us who know, again, as a parent of many kids, I mean, kids are very imaginative at a certain age, or maybe it's not that. Maybe they just legitimately didn't feel that they were fitting in some way, right? But the job of the parent is to correct that sort of thing. And again, not to have them refuse what they are, to have them accept what they are in whatever permutation of that identity that they have. It's not to shove them full of hormones or chemically castrate them, or even socially transition, because a lot of people say social transition, oh, that's fine. And that's when you kind of don't do anything medically, but you say, well, Jaren is going to go to school as a girl now. And the problem with that is that's not a cost-free intervention. All of a sudden, they develop a certain amount of momentum around that, and then changing back from that has negative social ramifications, and they may feel pressured not to do that. So I think really the only appropriate tolerance in public schools, which should not be value neutral spaces, is to say, no, we are going to have a zero tolerance on this sort of thing, because it is damaging to kids who we are entrusted to protect.
You mentioned that you moved away from Southern California towards the beginning of the COVID mess a couple of years ago. Have you noticed, or have your kids noticed a difference? I mean, you say it does exist even in Montana. Is it to a lesser extent in Southern California? Was it more ubiquitous?
Well, and I should back up. I was actually in Northern California because at the time I was at the Hoover Institution at Stanford.
Okay.
Clairemont's based in Southern California, and I joined with them a little bit before I came out here. But I think there's no question that it was more ubiquitous in these more liberal areas. You'll just see things on Twitter often from kind of liberal influencers kind of talking about this stuff. And I'm like, this would just not even be in our world here in Montana. It just couldn't happen. And I even know, unfortunately, this is without even having done some sort of a grand survey or people coming to me because of what I've written. I've had 2 friends who I don't really align with politically, but I kind of grew up with them in various ways, who, in kind of talking to them a little bit about the issue, have kind of confessed that they have kids who are kind of, they're not exactly trans, but they're kind of flirting with being trans in various ways. And in talking to them, it's really clear that this is just happening because there is unfortunately both a parental, to some extent, and I think more importantly, a social environment that they're in that is kind of saying this is okay, as opposed to no, this is not okay. And who you are is okay, but you are not this thing. Yeah. Even if you think you're this thing, you are a boy or a girl of certain qualities, right? But that's what you are. You're not. Every cell of your body is encoded with your sex, your birth sex, and we can't just change that because we don't feel that we fit into whatever gender role is being out there.
Yeah, that's one of the tricks the left has done, is to blur the lines biologically. And in fact, the Supreme Court nominee, what's a woman? Well, I'm not a biologist. Interestingly
Right.
enough, with Roe v. Wade possibly being overturned, they've quickly jumped back to understanding exactly what a woman is. I assume you've seen that too. The evil, in my opinion, at times can work in darkness. And part of your article, you mentioned this thing. Again, that's something I was not familiar with, but now I am. A transition closet. And this part was startling to me. Can you explain for my listeners that are saying transition closet? I don't get that either. What that is?
Yeah, and I mean, this is again one of these things where I just be arresting the people involved with it. But I don't want to. So far, this is not everywhere, but it has happened in a few places, and they're trying to grow. You can find articles about it. You can find them on Facebook, but it's essentially a wardrobe that is made available to kids who have decided they're trans or whatever in their social group, that they can go from home dressed in their actual clothing appropriate to their biological sex, and then change into this wardrobe that is sort of more trans friendly, which would typically be opposite sex, without their parents knowing about it. And this kind of brings up a broader issue of the amount of stuff that is going on that is being taught in school without parents knowing about it. The school can't give a kid an aspirin.
Yeah, right.
But they can do this. I mean, it's like outrageous that we're even talking about the fact that they're my kids, and I have every right to know any significant thing that is going on with them in school. And I think this is just a baseline issue. And again, I think politically, again, I don't want to reduce it to politics because I think it's so much more important than that. But politically, I think this is also a winning issue for the GOP to press, which is like, parents have every right to know anything that the kids are doing as involving gender identity in school. And it's incredible that, in fact, this is not the case in many, many jurisdictions around the country.
Right. And people might assume, well, of course, I'm in a deep red area. That's not going to happen here. That happens out in California and Los Angeles and the Bay Area is where the story that you linked to it was happening. However, within that story, I don't know if you noticed this, it started apparently in a Lutheran church in Arkansas.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's everywhere. And again, it's hardest because these adults involved are so confused. They've so made an idol in the religious sense of acceptance that they're not able to just understand the level of damage that they are doing. I mean, and another element of this is how deeply corrupted the medical establishment has been on this issue. Again, it's something I touched about in my piece with the American Academy of Pediatrics, which has unfortunately been totally captured by these pro-trans activists and not even letting kind of critical groups have booths at their medical groups, I'm talking about, at their convention. So it's really, it's crazy stuff. And I mean, a lot of people are going to win huge damage suits eventually on a lot of this stuff. But, we'll have to see for right now how it plays out.
The people that you mentioned, detransitioners, and again, this is a bit of a newer phenomenon. What do they usually say about what they went through and this kind of whole setup in general?
Yeah, well, and I've read a few of their stories, and you can kind of find them on the internet. If you go to the website of the Twitter site of the woman who I mentioned in my piece, she links to an organization that she's involved with that I think has a number of these folks sharing their stories. But I think the interesting thing is that often it isn't even people, and she's included in this, they weren't gender dysphoric as kids. It was sort of sudden, rapid onset gender dysphoria, which again is a social contagion ultimately. It's not a medical condition. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times social media is implicated or their friends are implicated or TV or something like that, or something that they're hearing in school, or maybe they just feel depressed. I was talking with a friend of mine who's a child psychiatrist who deals, as I think all these child psychiatrists do right now, with a number of these patients. And she's mentioned to me, and this is not a surprise because you can find this elsewhere, the high percentage of these young boys and girls who are on the autism spectrum somewhere, and they fixate on this sex or gender identity. And I don't understand all of the biological elements of autism or whatever else, but autistic people tend to fixate on things. And I think she says that a very significant disproportion of her kids who are presenting to her as transgender are also on the autism spectrum, right? So in some cases, there's a real medical thing going on, but it isn't that they need to go get pumped full of cross-sex hormones or start cutting off their breasts or something like that. It's that we need to treat their autism.
Right. And back to this young person, Jazz, from the show again, I Am Jazz. Of course, giant corporations got behind this young person. You mentioned that Johnson & Johnson gave the kid an endorsement deal. And Amazon had some kind of deal for the kid as well.
Yeah, they were on an Amazon show. I mean, if you go look Jazz Jennings on Wikipedia, which is how Jaren is presented, you'll see all the different groups that were involved with him. And again, I think we can either complain about that or we can go after these people legally. And I think it really should be the latter. I mean, that's what's really going to make the difference. You're seeing with what Ron DeSantis has done with Disney down in Florida, that's where it really makes the difference. If we construct an argument that says, hey, look, in elevating this child suffering from mental illness and kind of making them a celebrity, you have contributed to the damage done to these following kids who then watched and decided they were transgender. And we're going to try to hold you financially responsible for that in some way. And I think that is really something that we need to be doing. And again, just to talk about the elite capture of our institutions, Jaren/Jazz was admitted to Harvard.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I touch in the article that they've got lots of other obvious mental challenges that they're dealing with right now that don't have anything to do with transgenderism.
Yeah, can you get into what happened? That was a fascinating part of your article because this Jazz/Jaren kid, all of this money, all of this fame, again, admitted to Harvard, the Johnson & Johnson endorsement deal. And how did this person end up?
Yeah, well, they have obsessive compulsive eating. They've gained over 100 pounds. In addition, they've had the first of their transition surgeries occurred when they were 17, I believe. It's definitely still a minor. And they had complications because you're insulting a body and trying to make it something that it isn't. And so, of course, the body rebels against that for understandable reasons. And so there have now been 3 corrective surgeries on that. There are a number of other things I go into in the article, but this is a person who is clearly suffering a lot from physical and mental distress. And even though they're now, Jaren is technically an adult. I think he's 20. So theoretically can make his own decisions. I mean, he was victimized as a kid.
Yes.
And so, you still have a lot of sympathy for where he is, unfortunately.
Yes, he had issues and victimized. I mean, he's got issues now because he was victimized as a kid.
Right.
And all of these the people from these corporations jump on this. And it's sad. And again, I'm with you. We should have sympathy for people that go through this mess and all of these evil organizations just jumping on it for, I don't know if it's for them, just it's the trend of the moment and they want to be hip and out there. I kind of struggle with why corporations like Google and Apple, they always seem to be on the wrong side of these type of things.
Right. Well, I mean, I think some of it, and again, I don't want to turn it into too much of a religious issue, but when you remove God from your worldview, you begin making gods everywhere else, and you also don't have moral limits to anything, right? Like one could argue about the completeness or incompleteness of the Christian moral vision, but it's a clear moral vision that has had success in running a functional society despite everybody's sinfulness and whatever else for a long time. And when we begin starting from the year zero and we're just going to start out with an entirely new moral code and everything else, well, anything goes. And guess what? There's a reason why most of those moral standards were there in the first place, and that's because they worked. So I think that's part of it.
Yes, I do too.
I think another part of it is sometimes a lot of these very unusual people kind of do gravitate toward environments like technology. I mean, I worked in the tech business for a number of years. Certainly software developers and other folks are not necessarily conformist people, and some of them are going to be way outside the norm in that type of a way.
Yeah, well put there. One of my favorite sponsors is back with us here on Counterflow. That would be Texas Scorecard. Anytime you want to find out anything that's going on in the Texas political scene without a bad propagandized media narrative, just visit Texas Scorecard. They were founded in 2015 by a former Ron Paul congressional press secretary. They're Texas-based, they're a Texas-focused counterculture media organization. They've got so many cool things over at Texas Scorecard. Lots of podcasts, videos. Actually, I was a part of that. You can find a video there of me being interviewed in the Texas Scorecard studio. They've got live programming. They've got a print edition. They've got a very popular daily email newsletter highlighting the biggest stories of the day. They've even got a program to help grow the next generation of disruptors, and we like that. Their mission, disrupt statism and reconstitute self-governments. They are pro-citizen. They serve the grassroots against big government through narrative, tools, and information. They do not align with any party. I think that's very important. They work to hold lawmakers on both sides of the aisle accountable. They're a nonprofit. There's no paywalls. You guys aren't going to have to pay for any of this. The reporting is always free. Find them on all social media channels by searching Texas Scorecard. They're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of that. You can sign up for their free daily newsletter at texasminute.com. That is texasminute.com. Think about this. They support this program for you guys. So just give them a look. Texas Scorecard. Anytime you want to find out the real deal of what's going on in the Texas political scene, Texas Scorecard is your one-stop shop. Let's get back to the show. Are there laws popping up or avenues, I should say, to fight some of this?
Well, we're seeing some things. Florida has done a really good law that is now been signed by the governor that essentially says anybody, not only are you not allowed to kind of do these even social transition or certainly hormones or surgery to kids in our state, and I think Texas, I believe, has enacted something similar, although these are all, of course, being legally challenged.
Yeah.
But that there are going to be criminal penalties ultimately for people who are involved in them, and I think that is where we need to go, and we shouldn't be at all ashamed or we should feel great about that. Again, if my great grandkids are like, wow, I can't believe that my dad, my great grandfather was like, had such a hang up about, cutting off little kids' penises or breasts or whatever. I guess I'll take the L in that case.
Yeah.
But I just don't think that's likely. I think it's much more likely that this is going to be viewed ultimately in psychiatry, which has unfortunately had a number of these types of incidents, as a little bit similar to the craze of lobotomies in the 1940s, that went up through the 1940s and I think even the 1950s, where people had issues and we essentially turned them into non-functioning humans by mutilating their brains. Mm-hmm. Again, it wasn't that people had bad intentions, but they didn't pay any attention to the bad results. And I think that this is going to go down as unfortunately, another infamous chapter like that for psychiatry, and a lot of people are going to be very damaged and hopefully receive compensation for those damages as they should.
Over, at least in my lifetime, for the most part, the left has won most of their battles. They run basically everything at this point, corporation wise, and all the structures of power. Certainly, they become emboldened, and I think that's within human nature that you keep winning. Of course, you feel stronger and stronger. Does this feel to you like one of the areas where they've become a little too emboldened, and there's going to be a rightward swing back at them?
I do, and I think you're even seeing this in some traditional democratic communities, like particularly Hispanics. You're seeing it, but also African Americans, even where they have not drunk the Kool-Aid here, and they're kind of looking and going, "Wait a second, we're not for that at all." And I think ultimately, you can only fight reality for so long. You can only fight the damaging effects of this for so long. You can only shove deeply abnormal and deviant behavior and at people for so long and say, "Hey, this is normal and you have to celebrate it." At some point, there is a reaction. I actually hope, for the sake of everybody, that reaction is appropriately targeted and does not focus on the kids or young adults who, again, I think are largely the victims and need to be treated with great sympathy. And I certainly have always tried to do that when I've done it. But really, it's the perpetrators, it's the companies, it's the education establishment, it's the child psychiatrists, it's the folks who really should know better who've let us down here. And those are the people we need to be having our anger at and holding accountable for this.
Have you seen, even outside of this specific topic, have you seen a reawakening, or let's say maybe a shift in tactics and strategy from what I will call a newer version of the right wing in the past few years?
I think so. I mean, it's very encouraging. I mean, as somebody who's kind of been more of even though I have worked kind of with some deeply establishment figures over the years, but who's somebody who would have classified myself much more as on kind of the dissident side of the right, if you will, for quite some time. I can tell you, back in the mid to late 2000s doing this, you felt very alone and you're often kind of really attacked.
Yeah.
Now I absolutely do not feel alone. I feel like the grassroots energy in particular is really with me. And even the kind of very establishment voices are sometimes co-opting what we're trying to do. And that often makes people very angry. As somebody who's actually involved in elective politics, I don't see that as a negative. I see that as a positive. That's what happens when you're winning as an activist, is that ultimately your message gets co-opted to a degree by kind of more establishment voices who don't really care about it, but are like, well, this is just the direction things are trending. Right. Now, do we absolutely need to hold those people accountable? We do. But I'd much rather have people, kind of say, hey, you know what, look, this looks like a good issue. I don't really care that much about it, but I'm going to jump on it because I think it's my voters seem to care about it. I'd much rather have that. I'm not interested in being the eternal dissident. I'd like to win on these issues. And I think in general, there's been a great deal more fighting spirit on the right, on social conservatism, on community conservatism, on a variety of things. I think in some ways, J.D. Vance's primary win in Ohio, and he's a person who is very much kind of in my orbit of broader folks. But that was really an example of that. And Trump really was able to harness that energy. And at his best, Trump has done that. And I thought it was great that he really stepped in. But that was really a situation where a few people managed to propel this guy with, I think, a very compelling message, and who I think will win the Senate seat from nowhere to beat a number of really, really well-known politicians in the state of Ohio and take this nomination for Senate.
Do you see a red wave coming in 2022 elections, the midterms?
I do. I think the Roe v. Wade piece adds a bit of uncertainty. I do think that it doesn't, when I say uncertainty, I don't think that means that it's necessarily bad uncertainty. It's just uncertainty. the left, because they exist so much in this fact-free information bubble, they're convinced that, abortion is a women's issue and it's going to bring out all women because women, and women agree with this. But of course, if you look at the actual polling on abortion, there's really no substantial difference between how men and women think about it. It's if you're of a certain type of mindset, you're very against it. If you're not, you're very for it. I think the way that politically could cut is if the left kind of goes too extreme. And in fact, I saw J.D. Vance kind of pointing out that his opponent, his Democratic opponent, for the day after he won the nomination, was pointing out that he's kind of subscribed to abortion up to 40 weeks. Well, that's a pretty radical viewpoint that has been adopted by a lot of Democrats. At the same time, I think, and this is not a moral statement, it's just a political statement on mine, but if the Republicans rush through a bunch of abortion restrictions that have, no exceptions even for health of the mother or rape or incest, whether or not you feel that there should be no exceptions or not, I'm just making a political statement, not a moral one, then I think that there may be, the average voter might kind of feel like, well, that's a little too, out there for me. But I think right now, probably that's not going to be the decisive issue. And certainly all the trends besides that look really, really good for the GOP coming into this election cycle.
In closing here, I wanted to go back to the piece really quick, and that you end with a very important point. I want to get you to expound on it just a bit. You say at the end, there are no transgender kids. Can you drive home that point?
Yeah, no, and that's great. And I'm glad to clarify that, because I may have even slipped up in my own way that I was talking about it today, and that transgenderism is something that is being created by adults as an identity and presented to kids as, well, this is something that you can be. But it's there's no kid who truly is waking up outside of that type of adult influence and saying, I'm transgender in a persistent and knowledgeable way. Again, I talk about there are kids with gender dysphoria. I mean, gender dysphoria is a real thing that needs treatment. There are feminine boys, there are masculine girls, there are boys and girls who are going to want to engage in activities and maybe even dress that is not typical of their birth sex. But that does not make them transgender. It just doesn't. I mean, sex is encoded, again, in every cell of your body. Even if you go back to sort of the folks in the 1980s and kind of the drag ball scene in New York, things like that, these people were not, for the most part, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but they were not labeling, under the illusion that they actually were the opposite sex, even if they presented on stage as the opposite sex, nor were they demanding, by the way, that they kind of what their behavior be treated as normal and encouraged by society. They sort of understood that what they were doing, whether I agreed with it or not, was ultimately kind of a transgressive thing. And now we've kind of got this at the mall, at being promoted in the store, in the education establishment, the whole bit. It's on America's front porch, and parents need to just reach out and say enough and demand accountability.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. At the end, I'm in a small Texas town called Lockhart, about 30 minutes southeast of Austin, and there's this kind of hipstery restaurant here. And they're having a brunch, a drag queen brunch in like a few weeks or something. And they're presenting it as this, oh my God, look what we're going to do. It's like, it's not edgy anymore. I mean, normal boomers think that they'll watch RuPaul's Drag Race. It's not, right. It's funny that some of this is still like trying to put out there, like, look how edgy we are, people. We've got a drag brunch.
That's right. No. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's an important broader point, which is all of the true edginess right now is on the right. I mean, the left is a group of Mrs. Ratchets, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I mean, they are the school marms. they are, no matter how much they dress themselves up, they are the corporate establishment.
Yep.
And all of the true dissidents out there, virtually without exception, I mean, I'm sure there's some weird left-wing dissidents who are actually dissident against the system, are on the right. And so the cool kids, quote unquote, in some ways, in a good way, are sort of migrating a little bit. We're beginning to see this to the right. There was actually an interesting piece in New York Magazine that was sort of not a hit piece, unbelievably enough, about kind of the new right that came out about a month ago that made this point, even of like kind of edgy club kids in New York wearing MAGA hats, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just the energy is shifting and you can feel that. And that is a positive. The left has become uncool because there's nothing cool about what they are advocating for. And everybody can see that as much as they are trying to proclaim themselves to be dissidents, that they are the establishment.
Yes. I knew it was headed that way when I would see over 2020 posts, it's punk rock to wear a mask and stuff like this. Or I'm anti-authority, but I still got vaxxed and all this stuff. It's like,
right.
No, you're with the establishment now at this point. I'll get you to plug anything you would like, any of your work, any of your outlets, social media, anything.
Yeah, I'd say the best place to follow my work is my Twitter handle, which is Jeremy Carl 4, JeremyCarl 4. I am frequently throttled by the establishment at Twitter, so I always appreciate new followers. I frequently publish in The American Mind, American Greatness, sometimes Newsweek, but pretty much everything I do is out there, or you can go to the Clairemont Institute website. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my colleagues there. If you want to see kind of an intellectual conservatism that also fights really, really hard, I would absolutely put my colleagues second to none for doing that. It's a wonderful organization, and I would definitely encourage folks to come and learn more about that if they haven't already. Some really, really high-end thinkers and writers there.
Excellent. I will link to all of this in the show notes page for this episode. Jeremy Carl, thanks, man. Thanks for being here and sharing your thoughts on this wonderful piece that you wrote. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Well, I hope you got something out of that interview. And again, Jeremy Carl, thank you for being here. I hope you guys visit the new sponsor. Those guys, what a description of that podcast, right? As for this show, you know where to find everything. It's counterflowpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter @BuckRebel. And if you'd like to support me via Patreon, you can do that. Patreon.com/counterflow. As little as $1 a month. That's all it takes, or as much as you'd like. Every penny I make from you guys goes right back into this show. You've got my word on that. Thank you so much for the reviews and the ratings and reaching out. You can always reach out to me on Twitter, join the Telegram group and reach out. I love hearing from you, and I appreciate the support you give me. Thank you so much, and we will talk to you next week. See ya.
You get split in fucking half, I call the hologram wrath, but I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus, but I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.